Hi there, it's Grace Kraaijvanger. Welcome back to the Art of What's Next podcast. I hope you're doing great. Many of you listeners out there are tuning in because you're trying to figure out what you want to do in your next chapter. So, you may have heard me say before that after working with thousands of women now, I've seen a pattern in when the most profound transformation occurs. And it's this. We don't change when we're comfortable. We don't change when things are going along just fine. Why would we? We change when we're in the muck, when life throws us the curveballs, when grief has us on the floor, and when things feel like they're falling apart. My guest today is Amy Shoenthal, and she wrote a book about setbacks that I loved so much that I just had to share it with you. In her book, The Setback Cycle, Amy offers a framework that helps us clarify and persevere and even triumph during times of setbacks. She's a USA Today best-selling author. She's a journalist and marketing consultant. She's a top contributor to Forbes Women and Harvard Business Review. And Amy shines the spotlight on those who have been historically underestimated, yet also those who are doing the work to solve society's biggest problems. For this book, Amy interviewed hundreds of leaders, from politicians to Peloton instructors, from fashion icons to founders. And when I finished the book, I wanted to have a conversation for all of you on how to survive and even thrive the inevitable setbacks that life is going to throw our way. I'm so honored to have Amy on the show today. Welcome, Amy. Oh, Amy, I'm so happy to have you on the show today. As I mentioned, everyone, my guest is Amy Shoenthal. She wrote this fabulous book that I'm obsessed with now called The Setback Cycle: How Defining Moments Can Move Us Forward. And Amy, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me here.
I love it. I love it. So many of our listeners and people that have followed the High Breeze work know that I have a really kind of committed and consistent belief that so much of our greatest transformation happens from dark times, challenging times. So when I first found out about your book, I was like, this is my person. She's writing about something that I believe in so deeply. And I've just seen time and time again. And then the way that you wrote the book, telling stories of female founders and leaders and talking about their setbacks and the ways that they worked through them, it's really stunning, and I was so grateful for it. And I would just like to ask you first, as we kick off, if you would just share a bit about what inspired you to write The Setback Cycle and kind of how this began.
Of course. Well, I've been a journalist for many years, and I've been interviewing some of today's most prominent founders and leaders and business innovators and cultural icons. And I kept noticing that in almost every telling, every interview, every time they would tell me about their career journey and what led them to this moment, it was all born out of a setback. And I didn't come across the term setback for a while. I couldn't figure out what this common theme I was seeing was, because we all understand the concept of post-traumatic growth or learning from our mistakes. Those are okay, we get those. But this seemed to be, it didn't always fall into one of those categories. When I came upon the definition of a setback, it was a reversal or check in progress. And I was like, oh, that's it, right? Like it's always they're on a path, moving forward, working towards a goal, and they are unexpectedly bumped backwards. But it's in those moments, those low moments, where they have to get really creative and innovate and come up with new solutions for problems they didn't know existed. And it almost always turned out that the path they got on following a setback ended up being even better than the original path they were on. And
Right.
since I kept seeing it over and over, I decided to write about it because I figured if I could understand it, then I could learn from it and I could help others learn from it so that we could all have the tools and power to emerge from our next inevitable setback with a sense of resilience, creativity, and yeah, hopefully success.
It's so true because like I always joke like we don't make change when we're comfortable. Like why would we? When things are rosy and great, like that's not when you go trying to like untie and reframe and rebuild, and it's when things aren't, right? It's when they're hard. And um like you, I've seen it so many times that's when it's interesting because like so many of our listeners, our show is called The Art of What's Next. So it's all around this idea of like we're searching for what's next. And often we're searching for what's next because of a setback,
Yeah.
exactly as so beautifully described. So what I love about the way you framed the book, as I mentioned, is that it's told through stories of all these incredible women and many women that I know and have friendships with and admire, like Amy Nelson and Kate Luzio. I just think are extraordinary women that were also in the same space as the hybrid. We were going through very similar things during the
Right.
pandemic of having co-working spaces that were dedicated to elevating women and then having to figure out what to do with those spaces during it was completely unprecedented times for all of us. So there were so many of the stories that I was really moved and inspired by, and I want to go into those stories. But I loved how you framed it in there's a framework, right? And there are these four phases of the setback cycle that you framed each of those stories in. Will you just talk about those for our listeners so they can, because like I think what I loved about it too is that when things are muddy, murky, unclear, having a way to look at what feels like fragmented life stuff feels like how could any of these things possibly come together to show me the way. And then you brought this framework into it that I thought was just it was really beautiful and it's very simple and very resonant. So will you talk through it with us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the framework consists of the four E's. It's establish, embrace, explore, and emerge. Those are the four phases of the setback cycle. The first phase is establish, because establishing that we're in a setback is not always as intuitive as one might think, right? There are some setbacks that bonk you over the head. You're fired from a job,
Right.
a business partnership falls apart, an investor pulls out. Those are very obvious, or in your case, the pandemic
The
hit. Like that,
pandemic happens, for
very
example.
obvious setbacks.
Right.
So, yeah, those are clear. But in so many other cases, people sort of unconsciously float into their own setbacks with either without even realizing it or because they're choosing to ignore it. Like, how
Mhm.
many people do you know who have stayed in relationships for too long or stayed in jobs for too long, even when those situations were no longer serving them?
Like in your example in the beginning of the
Mhm.
book, you talk about how you went back to work after having your daughter, and it took you some time to realize that there was something happening around you that was deeply uncomfortable, and external forces that were external factors, I should say,
Yeah.
that were like awakening you to this reality that you were in a setback without maybe knowing that that's where you were headed. Do you want to talk about that really
Think,
quick?
yeah, I can talk about it. I think though, I think I was one of the people who ignored it because I
Yes.
didn't want it to be true.
Right.
I worked at a marketing agency and I took so much pride in my work. I was good at it. I was so good at running client accounts, running businesses. I was good at marketing. I was creative. I was a well-respected leader. And I just took so much pride in all of that. I was one of the people whose identity got totally caught up in their full-time job.
Right.
And when I went on maternity leave, I only had 12 weeks. So it was really, really short. It was like much shorter than industry standard. And so I went on maternity leave and I naively expected everything to be exactly as it was when I came back. And
You
you
were
were,
excited to get back to work in
I
some
was
way, right?
excited,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah.
Of course, I had mixed feelings about leaving my child, but I was so excited to return to the work I had previously taken so much pride in. So I went back. And again, any working parent will tell you it's an unrealistic expectation to think you can just sort of like slide right into the role you previously had. But in my case, I was told that I had several people replace me. And I was told that they were all going to stay on in that role, not temporarily, but indefinitely.
Which I
And
will say, I laughed out loud a little bit when it's like several people replaced you. I'm like,
that's also true. Yes,
interesting.
exactly.
Interesting.
Like we could talk about how much I was doing before I left, and when I left, I needed two replacements. And they were great. Like they did an amazing job. And so when I got back, it was like, we're gonna let them continue on because they were so good, and aren't they deserving of all the opportunities to thrive in the workplace? Like, don't they deserve this? And I was like, yes, they totally deserve this. But where did that leave me? There was no discussion of what I would work on now that this workload was off my plate. There was no, okay, we're taking you off of this. Maybe this is another opportunity for you. It was just kind of like, you'll figure it out.
Mhm.
But what's the subtle message there? You're a mom now, like you can't do as much. That was the subtle message I was receiving. And so I wanted to pretend it was all okay. And I kept trying to figure it out. And instead of turning my energy and ambition to this full-time job, I turned it to my freelance writing. And that's, it's not a coincidence that my freelance journalism career really took off, skyrocketed the same year I had my daughter. Because what happens when you sideline an ambitious woman? She turns her ambition elsewhere.
Right. Right.
So more writing led to more visibility, more invitations to speak on stages, more invitations to sit at tables I previously wasn't invited to, and people starting to ask me, hey, would you ever do marketing consulting on the side? 5 years later, perhaps, and perhaps expectedly, I was laid off from that job. By the time I was laid off, I had formed my LLC. I had a whole invoicing process. My website was live. I had at least one client on retainer. I built my lifeline before I needed it because, yeah, maybe I tried to ignore it in the beginning, but once I felt that discomfort, I started to explore my other options. So there's really something to be said about not ignoring your setback, or once you realize it, at least doing the work to acknowledge it so that you can like build your way out of it and work your way
Right.
through the cycle.
And I really appreciated your story because, again, for your framework of establishing that there is a setback, like you said, so there's so many setbacks that they hit you over the head. They're so clear. It's so obvious. It's so, one of mine, right before the pandemic was my little sister Maggie died, and it crushed me. It was like, I mean, it's obvious. It's like the kind that you describe in the book as like a wallop over the head. But then there's plenty that you don't realize are happening until you're a little deeper into them. And I really appreciated the nuance that you showed there of like establishing the setback, whether it's a big bonk over the head
Yeah.
or something that's a bit insidious. That's step one, right? To establish.
Yeah, I know. That's phase one. So
Yeah.
that could take like a second or it could take years. It could take
Mhm.
decades.
Mhm.
So once you establish you're in a setback, you have to go to phase two, which is embrace. This is the tough phase where you have to get uncomfortable.
Mhm.
But as you mentioned before, as a society, we've been conditioned to avoid discomfort. But this is where the transformation happens, right? Like if you think about the
100%.
yeah,
100%.
if you think about the neuroscience behind it, we all know what a dopamine dip and a dopamine hit is, and you learn more from the dopamine dips because that's what leads to the rewiring and reframing and learning center of your brain saying, "Hey, we don't want to experience this again. We need to course correct and find a different way out." So, embrace is when you have to kind of take stock of your situation and say, why did this happen? What role did I have in it? What was out of my control? What can I control now? What did I learn? What did I learn? And also, why did this impact me so much? If a business investor pulls out, of course, there's a financial hit. But where have you felt this before? Like, did someone abandon you in some other relationship? There's always more to it if you do a little like double click, like, oh, this is bad because why? But if you keep asking yourself, but why else is it bad? Why else is this impacting you so much? So there's a lot to be learned from the discomfort if you can sit in it and really, again, like embrace it because
Right.
that's how you work your way to phase three of the setback cycle, which is explore. And explore is the most fun phase. This is where we get to play with what's possible. We get to start to figure out our options. Again, we're just exploring and we're not committing to anything yet, which is what makes this phase a lot of fun. This is where we figure out what our superpowers are and we start to blend our passion with our strength to
Mhm.
figure out what's the best path forward. Then we go to the final phase of the setback cycle, phase four, emerge. So the emerge phase can be exhilarating. right? Now you have the tools. It's time to figure out what to build. But going from knowing to doing can be surprisingly complicated. It's like,
100%. I always say like it takes as long as it takes, and it always takes longer than you think. Right.
absolutely. And look, after all the establishing and introspection and planning and exploring and strategizing again and problem solving, you are exhausted. So when
Right.
you get to emerge, it's of course it's this glorious moment where you come out of your setback and you have the clarity you've been looking for. But sometimes in that moment, you just need to take a rest. So you need to take a break, recognize any barriers you might still be facing, and give yourself the grace to step around them. And then when you're ready, you can move forward and your metamorphosis is complete and you have completed the setback cycle.
And what's so interesting, and I think inspiring about looking at it as like this framework, is that we know through our lives that it's circular in a way. Like we're never like we'll take all those setbacks and the transformation that can happen through that process, and surely there will be another setback.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how life is, right? Like we don't just get to decide, okay, I'm done now, like transformation complete. But what I think was really cool about the way that you described so many of the stories is this cumulative idea, like you said, of like we take all this pain and all this learning and all this, exploration and the seeking and the unknown and we take it forward into this stage of really emerging from that setback. But we'll take that again, we'll take all of that accumulation again into the next cycle, and we're stronger, more aware, not necessarily like immune to the pain, but
No,
we're stronger, more aware, and we take that all with us the next time. I thought that was just
it
a really
really
beautiful thing.
helps. It really helps. Look, since I wrote the book, I have had many setbacks, but it really helps to have a framework and it really helps to recognize the moment you're in. So after you read the book, you're going to have a whole new perspective on setbacks and you'll be able to emerge from your next one, perhaps more quickly, but at least with the clarity of the situation you're in, and you'll have the tools you need to figure out how to move forward.
100%, 100%. Well, I loved, one of the things I loved about the book is just the way that every chapter is a personal story,
Yeah.
again, of a female founder who's willing to be really transparent and vulnerable in telling her story about setbacks. Would you like to pick one of them? Like, give us an example, because I mentioned some of the leaders: Amy Nelson, who is the founder of the Riveter; Kate Luzio, who's founder of Luminary, which I love both of those women and organizations. Stacy London, Robin Arzón, who is a really popular Peloton instructor. I certainly spent a lot of time with her during the pandemic with me and
Yep.
my Peloton. Would you grab one of those and just tell our listeners a little bit about what they can experience as kind of going deeper into these personal stories?
Sure. One that I find easy to explain in these interviews um, is the setback of Norma Kamali. So she is a legendary fashion designer. She's one of the people who's actually sort of defied the laws of fashion because she has maintained her status as a top designer for the past 50 years. And that is an incredible amount of time to last in the fashion industry, especially as a
Yeah.
woman. And so Norma has had many setbacks, but the one that I wrote about in the book, is when she first started out. She first created her business in the 70s. And like many women in that time, she was easily convinced that her husband should run the finances. And she let him run the finances, and he was much more extroverted than she was. She liked to stay in, he liked to go out, he had a big social life. He was spending those finances that she was earning through the business on his social life. And there was some infidelity, he was cheating. And so it was just like the
Mm.
classic, you know, textbook bro running the finances and running the
Yeah.
business to the
We've heard
ground.
this story before, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But in Norma's case, she knew what was going on and she was trying to figure out what to do about it. She wanted to get out, but she didn't quite know how. I mean, this was her husband. She was married to him. Plus, he was her business partner. It's complicated. And one day she said, there's always something that makes you realize, that makes the path forward so clear and makes you realize it is time to move on from that
Mhm.
situation. For Norma, that was when she was at her store and she had a workroom in the back. She was in her workroom, and one of the women that her husband was cheating on her with came into the workroom and started talking to her in sort of a unfriendly way, let's say. And at that moment, the ceiling of the workstation crashed over her table. It just crashed right down.
Right.
The ceiling literally and figuratively crashed down over her business. And she said that was it. That was the only sign I needed to walk away. So, with $98 to her name, she walked out of her marriage and she completely abandoned the business that she had created herself. That was brave. That was bold. That was scary. She rented an apartment with just like a mattress and nothing else.
Hmm.
She started asking for help. She told someone, "Hey, do you have a sewing machine I could borrow? Do you have some fabric?" And she's Norma Kamali. So 3 years later, she had created a new business called OMO, On My Own.
I love
And that
it.
turned into the global multi-million dollar brand that you know today as Norma Kamali Designs. Now she created the swimsuit that Martha Stewart wore on the cover of Sports Illustrated. She brought hot pants to the US, which by the way, hot pants are short shorts, so I'm not really sure why they're called hot pants. She created the sleeping bag coat.
Yes,
Um,
I love that part.
she's iconic, and she did not like, she took her setback and she propelled herself forward.
And we need these stories because when you're in the deep, dark throes of a setback, it feels like there's no way out. It can feel, and not to put words in our listeners' mouths, because, and I'll just say for myself, I certainly felt like this. Like it can feel like no one is experiencing what you're experiencing, and it can feel so lonely. And by going into these stories, where especially when people are like in the stories that you share, where people are really willing to tell how real it got, how dark it got, like a mattress on the floor and having to ask for a sewing machine when you had a fashion empire just moments ago,
Yeah.
until the ceiling literally fell in on you. So I think it's interesting for our listeners, and I want to just point that out, of like, we just need to remember that we're not alone in
No, we're not.
these dark times,
We're
right?
not. It is a setback is such a universal experience.
Right.
People have been talking about it. People will tell me about their setbacks even before reading the book. And they're like, just by understanding that this book exists, it gave me a whole new perspective on my life experience. So
Right.
it's something that people understand, but maybe weren't able to articulate until now.
And I also think it opens the dialogue and conversation about being transparent about the pain of your setbacks. And
Exactly.
I know one thing that came up for me when I was reading it, and I'll share this because my listeners, many already know this about me, but as I mentioned, my baby sister died in 2018, right when the Hivery was really expanding and growing, and that was gut wrenching. And we were opening up our second location in San Francisco, which we opened the next year. And because when she passed away of breast cancer, and my cousin passed away of breast cancer, I decided to have a preventative double mastectomy in that year. And then the pandemic happened and like crushed my business. So I was like, lost my sister, lost my cousin, had a mastectomy, lost my business. And one of the things that is interesting in that time is, number one, like it can feel like setbacks cluster. That's just as
Yeah.
a note. It feels like they can, like, that the whole idea of when it rains, it pours is not a joke.
No.
Um, but what I think is really interesting and important, and I thought about a lot when I was reading your book, is that social media can make it look like you are getting out of those setbacks a lot easier than you actually are.
Oh
Right.
yeah. Oh yeah.
So I think the truth in these stories really helps us reframe. Like when I think that I'm watching someone get through something easier or faster than I am, it's because I might be watching it through the lens of Instagram
Yeah.
versus these stories going deeper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that, of just like, I don't even mean it as contrite as advice or tips, but just for people that are feeling like they're really in it and feeling alone in it. Do you have any wisdom that you want to share on that?
I think, well, I can give some tips, but I think the piece on social media is, I think that's actually changing a little bit. I think people are craving more of the messy middle than they used to
Mhm.
be. And I think people want people are feeling vulnerable enough, or people are feeling confident enough to share their vulnerabilities
I
now.
agree. I
Um,
agree.
I mean, that goes for me too. I definitely have been, I'm a person who writes other people's stories. But this past year, I had to be pushed into sharing my own story. And the more I was pushed, the more I saw that it would resonate with other people and the impact that I saw it having. Again, like, I'm like, it's just my little story. Who cares? And so many people care because so
Right.
many people, because my story is really relatable. So many people have experienced my little setback in the workplace, and I was like, it's not that dramatic. Like, what's the big deal? Why should I share it? That's exactly why, because everyone
Exactly.
has this experience, and your experience is so much more universal than you realize. But all it takes is you sharing it and being willing to just start talking about it. It doesn't have to be public on social media. One of the things that I have a whole chapter dedicated to community in the explore phase. So when you're in phase 3, you've done the embracing and now you're testing out new ideas. One of the best things you can do is turn to your community. Now, you asked, what advice do I have for people when they're really in those low moments and they're afraid they're like never going to come out of it. Here, here is where we create a narrative born of our own self-doubt.
Hmm.
And when you create that narrative, you will find the proof to support it. But if you create a counter argument to that self-doubt narrative, all of a sudden new proof points boil to the surface. And the way to find those new proof points is to turn to your community. Now, one of the women I interviewed, her name is Susan McPherson. She's the author of The Lost Art of Connecting. And
Hmm.
she equates our communities to constellations. And she points out that we're far more interconnected than we think. And all it takes is one link to another star in that constellation for us to really see how vast our network is, how expansive our community is. And when we're combating that self-doubt narrative, our community is going to give us that counter argument. And that constellation, that other galaxy over here, they're going to show you just how bright you can shine. So at that moment, you kind of have to decide though, like sure, it's your community, but it also has to come from you. You have to decide who you're going to believe. The people who validate that self-doubt narrative, or the people who are showing you what you're really capable of.
Exactly.
So yes, it
Exactly.
has to come from you.
And I mean, I think that that's critically important. And as for those of you that can't see me, I'm like nodding emphatically to everything that Amy just said, because when you're in these places of the unknown, or in these places that feel like defeat, it is lonely in there. And the inner critic gets noisy in there. And the longer that you stay in there alone, the more likely you are to believe, like you said, to believe the inner critic, to
Yep.
believe the voices in your head that tell you that you failed, or that you're never going to be able to figure this out, or that you're never going to get to that goal or milestone because of X, Y, and Z. The longer you stay in that place alone, the harder it is to work your way out of it. So I mean, I almost started clapping when I got to the community chapter, because I was like, oh my God, she's my person. It's
Yeah.
just it's amazing, and it's also kind of interesting. I'm curious what you think. Don't you think it's kind of interesting how we sometimes avoid the very things that we know can help us, community being one of them?
Yeah. Well, sometimes when you're really in a low moment, you don't want to talk to people. You just want to retreat. And I just want to say that's okay. If
Yeah,
you need a little bit, give yourself the space, but don't fall into rumination.
right.
You know what I mean? Put limits on your wallowing
I
and
agree.
then
And
go get help. If you're struggling to get out of that cycle of rumination, go get help. It does not have to be in your community. Like, go find a mental health professional to help you out of it, but talk to someone.
yeah.
Because if you need the help, you have to go get it, whatever form that help takes.
And yeah, because even the very nature of setback can be so wide and broad, and there's trauma and all kinds of deep layers of pain involved. I just thought it was really beautiful that you brought in the idea of not facing that alone. And the same is true in the transparency of our stories. Going back to what we were just talking about with social media, like, I remember Glennon Doyle talked at one point about how she wrote the books and blogs way back when that she did with space to process them. Like she
Yeah.
didn't write them when she didn't share them, I should say, when it was like the white hot pain. She shared them when she'd had some space for them. So
Yeah.
even as we were talking about how social media has shifted into something that allows us to be more honest and transparent about the reality of our lives, we're all kind of exhausted by the shiny filter of it all.
Yeah.
But that also goes with having enough space that you feel ready to share your story.
Absolutely. Yeah. You have to go
Yeah.
through the cycle in your own way on your own time, but at least know what's available to you so that if you get stuck in one place, you can understand what's next and you can move to it at your own pace.
Right, right. I think that's so beautiful. Um do you find that people want to rush the process a little bit and
Yeah.
say like,
Yeah.
Amy, I don't feel good. Can I skip to stage 4? Can I get out of here? Like how does that part work or
Yes.
feel?
As humans, we are conditioned to avoid discomfort. Do you think I'm the setback expert? I wrote the framework and I still want to skip ahead to explore. I don't want to sit and embrace.
Right.
It sucks. It sucks there. I don't want it. I
Right.
know I'm supposed to stay in it. And now that I understand it, I have to like force myself to stay in it, but it goes against my instincts. I want
Right.
to fast forward through it all the time. And again, I have all the tools. Like, so it is not like I'm not immune to the
Yes.
things, to the pitfalls that I write about. Like I am also human. And yeah, everyone wants to fast forward. It's like you either want to fast forward or you want to just like stay in one spot and not move forward. So
Interesting.
it's hard to just like go through at a healthy pace, frankly.
So what do we do? What are the practical things that we do when we either want to fast forward or when we're stuck in one stage of the setback cycle, presumably an earlier stage than we'd
Yeah,
like?
like embrace. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So, because you talk about some, practical tools around personal statements and writing. And writing is obviously part of your creative unlocking.
Yeah.
But talk to our listeners about what practical things they can do.
If you find that you're stuck in embrace, so if you think about the stress response, we understand fight and flight, but there's actually a third response, and that's freeze. So if
Mhm.
you find that you're stuck in a freeze, I have an exercise in the book called Thaw Yourself Out. And it is just very gentle guidance for you to start to, again, like thaw yourself out if you are frozen and you do not know how to move forward. And a
Right,
lot of it just asks, like, why is this impacting me so much? Why am I frozen? What's one small thing I can do right now to move forward? What would make me feel really good right now? Right? You could think big. What would make me feel really good right now? Winning the lottery, getting my job back, like all kinds of crazy big things. Okay, why do I want that? How would it make me feel? How can I get that feeling in some realistic way? I have a
right,
whole exercise also called the curiosity quiz. And that's when we go and explore our capital C deep rooted curiosity. And that exercise involves painting a picture of like who we are as our most idealistic self, and then introducing our idealistic self to our realistic self. So it's like, think big, think of all the things you wish you could have or want or be, and bring some pieces of that into your everyday. We can do all
right,
the manifesting and dreaming that we want, but at the end of the day, how can we take action to like move in that direction to some extent?
right, right. It's so true because like, and I think um that's kind of the marriage of like inspiration and manifestation and some of the things that people might call woo woo, which
Yeah,
I'm into.
that's
Um,
fine. We can be
but
woo.
we can be woo woo. But what I love about being woo woo is when you have the practical application. So when you marry those two together, then you have action, right? So,
Exactly.
oh, I love that. I love that. Well, you said something that I think it resonated with me, and it's really interesting. Of like the woman that created the framework, the woman that is so like this book is one of the best research books I've ever read. We were talking before we started recording of like the end notes are like a study in and of themselves. So
Yeah.
there's so much good stuff
I
in
am a
here.
journalist. I
Yeah.
did my research. I had to.
It's really stunningly researched. I loved the book, but what I was kind of gravitating to, because I feel this myself, like sometimes when we're leaders in something, people think that we've got it figured out, but really, I can speak for myself in this category. We teach what we need to learn, right?
Yes.
So what are you working on right now? Let us into your, whether it's your part of the setback cycle or your, what you're exploring. Like, let us into Amy's world of what you're working on now in that way.
Well, right now, I do feel like the publication of this book was my emerge phase. And I didn't realize it at the time, but really writing the book, getting the book deal, doing all the things was me working through my career setback. And so I do feel like this is my emerge phase.
Yes.
Right now, what am I working on? I am preparing for a TEDx talk this coming Saturday. I don't know when this is going to air, so I'm sorry if
Yeah.
this has already happened, but I'm preparing for my TEDx talk. And that right now is sort of like dominating my life because I'm rehearsing like crazy to make sure I do a good job. And then after that, I really just turn to the book tour is wrapping up. It's the end of April. The book's been out for a month and a half. So book launch phase is sort of wrapping, and I'm going into what I call like sustaining phase. And it's
Yeah.
just a lot of corporate speaking engagements. A lot of companies are bringing me in to do workshops for their teams. So I can take them through the setback cycle. I have a workshop that I do called Leading Through Tumultuous Times. And it's all about not just like C-suite executives, but more like the middle managers and how to navigate their teams if they were impacted by restructuring and layoffs, because layoffs don't just impact the person who is gone, they impact the team that is left behind. And there's all kinds
100%.
of, you know, reevaluating. I mean, it's a setback when a lot of your team goes away, it's a setback in the workplace. And so I've been helping some organizations figure that out. And then I'm just doing a lot of events and things at some of the big tech companies, some women's organizations, and that's pretty much how I'm spending my summer. I'm doing some coaching. People are hiring me to coach them through a setback before they move into like a formal executive coaching program. They want to kind of get clarity before they move
Yeah.
forward into that. Like, do I want to become a CMO, or do I want to just remain a vice president, or do I want to switch industries? Like, they're kind of working with me on that before they go and get, you know, whatever they want to do next. So that's a little bit of what I have going on. And then of course I do have an idea for another book. So I'm starting to put that outline together, because why would I rest?
Right. Well,
I am.
and I mean, everything that you just described is really the epitome of emergence. Like you're putting like the TEDx talk, the coaching, the corporate coaching and facilitation is all part of being more and more visible and come and emerging out of, again, out of your own setback. So we tend to like you're living and breathing the framework and the experience. It's really admirable. It's really
Yeah.
beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
What's the most rewarding part of this work? Like, what's the part that you're like, God, if you took it all away, just like this is the part that I just love.
The part where at the very beginning of this interview, you said that this was a beautiful book and you related to it and it impacted you. And maybe even the part where you said you feel like we're friends just from reading my book, because so many people say that. And people who I know who read the book say, I feel like I'm just hanging out with you. So I think I just happen to write the way I talk or the way I act, like
Mhm.
it's all sort of the same. And it's just, you said it was well researched, and it is, but it's also a very down to earth, friendly, and approachable and accessible quick read. And so
Yes.
hearing that people are taking away what I wanted to put out and what I wanted them to take away from the book, and hearing people like you say that it impacted you in exactly the way I intended for it to impact people, that's everything. That made
Yeah.
everything worth it.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And it's really inspiring, I think, for our listeners out there to know that, you can be in this very early stage of setback
Yeah.
and that there is on the other end of it that there are stories like yours of people that have really stepped into the work that they were meant to do because of the setback,
Yeah.
and getting this reward of, I mean, your reward is basically that other people are feeling the resonance of your book, like your story
Yeah.
and the stories that you told are inspiring others. So that is an exponential snowball effect that we can't even imagine,
Totally.
right?
Totally. Like there's the, oh, you made the USA Today bestseller list a few weeks in a row. Like, wow, that's a great accolade. And there's the, oh, you were invited to give the TEDx talk because critics are responding favorably to your ideas. Like these are great accolades. But what is most meaningful is hearing individuals telling me that the book gave them such a renewed perspective on the experience that they've had and gives them the understanding that they will emerge from their next setback with a sense of resilience and confidence and an understanding of all they are capable of. Like
Yeah,
that's it. That's everything.
that's really beautiful. That's really beautiful. So, Amy, tell our listeners where they can learn more about you and your work. And I'll have it all in the show notes too, but
Of
just
course,
give us
of
some
course.
good.
I have a website, thesetbackcycle.com, if you want to learn more about the book. And I'm on Instagram at Amy Show and LinkedIn, just my full name, Amy Shoenthal. Those are really the best ways to contact me.
I love it. I love it. And everybody, will put everything in the show notes. Is there anything else that you want to share? Any last parting pieces of advice or wisdom that you just want to give our listeners as they're maybe in their own, in the beginnings, middle, or end of their own setback cycle?
Just remember that setbacks set the stage for reinvention. And if you are in it right now, you now have all the tools you need to work through it, to understand how to help you figure out what might be next for you, and to gain a sense of all the possibilities available to you. And again, you will emerge from this setback with the confidence and clarity about all you can achieve. Like you are capable of so much more than you realize.
That's so beautiful. We're so lucky to get to enjoy this conversation with you. I did love the book. I will say, and I mentioned this before we started recording, I read the book because we had this interview scheduled. And I read the book because we have a number of people in common, and I was interested in hearing the stories through their lens. But as I got into the book, I was like, this I'm like, like you said, it felt we were just meeting for this interview, and you felt like an old friend in this book. So I know that there are many, many people out there that are going to feel the same way that I did, and many, many people that really need your book. So, Amy, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. I'm so grateful for you, and I'm so excited for everybody to read The Setback Cycle.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful for you. And I'm also excited for that. Please come talk to me after you read the book and tell me all about your setbacks.
Yes, great, great. Amy, thanks so much for being on the show. I can't wait for everybody to read your book.
Thank you so much.
I hope you found this episode helpful, idea provoking, and inspiring, especially if you're in the midst of creating or clarifying your next chapter. I can't even put into words how much I appreciate you, your vulnerability, your stories of creating a life and meaningful work amidst adversity, grief, ever-changing and challenging times, and of course, life's peaks and uncertain valleys. You are seekers, wisdom sharers, and artists of life, and together we can build meaningful next chapters that feel aligned with who we really are, what we're put on this earth to do, and how we can make a difference one human being at a time. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And I would love it if you could leave a review for The Art of What's Next. If you know someone who wants to create a new chapter or who would appreciate this episode, please share it with them. You can text it to them or email them the link or post about the show on your Instagram. If you want more help in creating your own meaningful next chapter, join the Hivery newsletter to get inspiration, stories, and resources to help you create your next chapter like an artist. Sign up at thehivery.com/podcast or at the link in the show notes.